Hey everybody, my guest today is Professor John Sanbonmatsu, and we're going to talk about animal ethics. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Jason. It's great to be here.
Okay, so I know you recently wrote a book called The Omnivore's Deception, and I was hoping that you could give a summary of the argument.
But what I argue in this book is not simply that we need to embrace a universal vegan diet, which I do argue, but that we have organized our entire identity as a species around harming all the other beings of this planet. So the title of my book, The Omnivore's Deception, really is looking at three forms of deception. The first is simple apparatus that surrounds our our violence against animals, particularly in the food system, which is where we most encounter animals, right? Is on our plates these days. Very few people have any conception of the scale or intensity of the violence that we inflict on other beings in that system, the food system. But we're killing about 80 billion land animals every year, mammals and birds mostly, and up to almost 3 trillion marine animals every single year. None of which is necessary because humans, in fact, thrive on plant-based diets. So the first mode of deception I talk about in the book is simply the way corporate industry, but also through our kind of cultural myths that have developed over centuries and millennia, we have come to believe this idea that humans naturally are meant to dominate and harm and exploit other beings of the planet. The second mode of deception I talk about is the arguments and a kind of narrative that was created about 20 years ago by a variety of critics, suggesting that the problems with animal agriculture can be reduced to so-called factory farming. Now, that's a longer discussion, but essentially, in reality, as you know, there have been philosophical critiques of our domination of animals for nearly 3,000 years. Whereas so-called, factory farming, industrialized animal agriculture, intensified animal agriculture only gets underway around the turn of the 20th century. So, well, late 19th into the early 20th centuries. So, the title of my book, The Omnivore's Deception, is meant to resonate with a famous book published in 2006. Next year will be the 20th anniversary of The Omnivore's Dilemma by the acclaimed writer Michael Pollan. And Pollan, Temple Grandin, Barbara Kingsolver, and a variety of other critics have argued that we can have our meat and our conscience too by embracing smaller scale, so-called pastoral modes of animal production. And I show in this book in great detail why that is not true, why that's a myth. And finally, the last mode of deception is self-deception, which is to say we don't want to take responsibility for what we do to our fellow creatures here on this earth. And I talk about a concept that the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre called mauvaise foi or bad faith. And bad faith is merely what happens when we lie to ourselves about what we do and when we avoid the consequences of our values and actions. So we don't really want to know how the food on our plate got there. Most people don't want to know, and so they allow themselves to become susceptible to really bad arguments in favor of continuing the system. So in a nutshell, sorry to go on so long. In a nutshell, that's my argument in this book.
So I think it would be good if we kind of dove deeper into each of the three deceptions. So the first deception is about basically our mentality that sees animals as instruments for us, right? We see them as means. We feel like that we can treat them in a certain way because they're there to support our nutrition, and that's just kind of natural, right? It's kind of like there's a food chain and we're on the top of the food chain. Okay. I know traditionally some philosophers, influential philosophers, have believed this because animals just weren't like the rational animal. I know now the conversation has kind of shifted. I know contemporary philosophers are much more open to this idea that animals should have rights, or at least we have certain responsibilities to treat animals in certain ways because they matter in and of themselves. Okay, so I kind of want to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, you've touched on a variety of really important issues there. I want to begin where you did, which is with the idea that what we do to other animals is natural, right? I really think that's the key to this whole structure is that and that's why I begin with that in my book. We think that well, we're just like any other predator. We're at the top of the food chain, and therefore, in the same way that the lion hunts the gazelle on the open plains, we what genetically engineer mice, we sexually mutilate cattle, and put them in confinement, and then kill them while they're still young. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which this ideology of the natural uh, is kind of the fulcrum of the thing. But that idea goes back, way back thousands of years. In my book, I talk about some of the predecessors to this system, in terms of philosophical outlook, but also practices, including slavery. I mean, human slavery was modeled on so-called animal domestication. That is to say, the controlled sexual reproduction and exploitation of animals for food. Human slavery was based on that model. But ultimately, as you say, we view other animals as uh, actually as our tools. And you find contemporary writers like Barbara Kingsolver, the acclaimed Canadian writer. I'm sorry, she's not, she's an American writer, um, literally referring to animals as, quote, four-legged tools. Well, that idea of a four-legged tool goes back to Aristotle 2,500 years ago, because the Greeks believed that there were just natural hierarchies. And so that men are meant to dominate women, masters are meant to dominate slaves, etc. And humans, of course, are so-called meant to dominate the other species. It's simply not true. But to kind of convince ourselves that that's true, there are all of these philosophical concepts that have been developed over the centuries by leading philosophers like Immanuel Kant, Hegel, and so on, that tell us that, well, because other animals, as you say, can't be rational, supposedly, therefore they can't be persons, they can't be subjects.
Yeah, so this deception then perhaps is constituted by two parts. One part is an empirical claim, which is that it's just the natural order of things that we dominate non-human animals. And the other part is the moral claim, which is that it's okay to dominate non-human animals. And they're connected because the fact that it's okay to do it is explained by the fact that it's natural.
Yeah, absolutely. I would just say this, that the so-called empirical claim, you're absolutely right. There's a very strong there are all these empirical claims that are implicit in the way philosophers talk about animals. I mean, for example, Immanuel Kant and Hegel, they didn't know anything about animals. I mean, not really. I don't think they had many encounters with them, if any, right? They're simply giving these kind of transhistorical making these transhistorical claims about the ontology of other beings without really dealing with a period of European scientific literature that was crude, in terms of what we understand about other beings today. But I just want to say that beneath this so-called empiricism is actually a metaphysics. So, you start with the metaphysical claim, which is that humans either were created by God in the image of God or are uniquely rational on the earth. You start there, and then you gather empirical data perhaps to prove what you already think you know. Now, actually, as I said, in the Western tradition, philosophers mostly didn't feel they had to accumulate empirical data. Descartes didn't spend much time, talking about the existing literature of his time. And he, as you know, revolutionized, but in a bad way, our understanding of animals by reducing them to the status of machines. And he would take a live dog and nail the dog to a board while the dog is crying out, and then cut the dog open just to show the circulatory system. And he said that the cries of the dogs were the equivalent of cogs turning in us inside a machine.
I didn't know he did that.
Yeah, he talks he in his discourse on method, he advises the reader to take a large animal and do this, cut them open while they're still alive, so you can see the system. I mean, and there were contemporaries of Descartes who thought this was appalling. It's really a shame that the Western tradition ended up being based on Descartes rather than, say, Montaigne, the earlier, well, contemporary Descartes, really, but the French essayist who, in his apology to Raymond Sebon, provides a naturalistic account of other animals and a defense of them. Uh, I'm not saying there isn't good stuff in Descartes. I mean, Descartes and his methodology, his conception of reason was quite proved quite important for overcoming, superstition and a certain irrationality within European thought. But at the same time, it created a new form of irrationality. The philosophers Adorno and Horkheimer talk about that, how enlightenment turns into its opposite in a sense. It kind of reintroduces its own mythology. And this new mythology, which is connected to an older one, is about control, domination, and subordination of animals and nature to human manipulation.
Okay. So maybe it's not best characterized as an empirical claim and a moral claim, but first maybe like a metaphysical claim and a moral claim, right? And they're related. So the metaphysical claim would be something like we are the rational beings, other animals are not rational beings, and therefore aren't persons and don't deserve rights. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And then like the rights part would, and this, because they don't deserve rights, we can treat them kind of like as we wish because they're not ends in themselves. And so kind of like this, it's a very close connection between like the metaphysical claim and the moral claims there. Okay. So
Hmm.
that's the first deception, right? Like that you just take that to be blatantly false.
Yes. Yes. And luckily, happily, we do have an enormous wealth of data and experience now to be able to say incontrovertibly that Darwin was right. Charles Darwin, right? He writes Origin of Species, and gosh, was it 1859? But then he follows that up with the more radical book, The Descent of Man, in 1871. And that's like truly scandalous because it's in that book where he says that, well, humans are apes, or we descended from other beings. We are not in a class by ourselves. God did not create us like out of clay. And Darwin denied that there were qualitative distinctions between humans and other species. Maybe not all qualitative, but he stresses the continuities, right, between us and other beings. And so there's a large literature now in animal ethics and what we call cognitive ethology, and critical animal studies, showing that we have set up this opposition between the human and the animal. Well, we are animals. And I don't mean that figuratively. I mean, that's the thing. People think, I teach undergraduate students, and they often reproduce this dichotomy. There's humans and then there's everybody else. But it's understandable why we should think that because only we have a complex language that allows us to abstract from immediate context and to manipulate ideas and at a very high level of abstraction, right? So that is it's understandable, but it's also kind of mistaken because it obscures, for example, our emotional uh, uh, continuities with other beings. We are not the only thinking, feeling being on this planet, but we act as though we were, and that is leading to the destruction of the entire living Earth. That idea and that set of practices, institutional norms, modes of economic development and culture, and so on, that is dooming us and all the other beings. Because if the other beings of the earth die, as they are dying, we're in the biggest mass species extinction event in over 65 million years. If they die, we cannot live on a planet devoid of life. If the pollinators die, we're not going to have crops, right? Uh, and they are dying. The insects, the invertebrates are all dying because of capitalist development and this conception that I've described as of domination of other beings, what some critics call speciesism or human supremacism.
Is your position that animals matter in and of themselves because they can suffer?
No, that's a position that was famously developed by a utilitarian philosopher named Peter Singer. Singer wrote a very influential book called Animal Liberation, 1975. And Singer's often called the so-called father of the modern animal rights movement. In fact, Singer was already, I mean, he credits them in his acknowledgments or wherever in that book. Singer was already he was using data, he was using the archives of animal rights groups who already existed. Nonetheless, that was a very important moment in the history of animal rights. And and Singer specifically talks about Jeremy Bentham's philosophy. Bentham was the guy who invented the term utilitarianism, which is the idea that we should act in such a way as to maximize the good for the greatest number of persons affected or subjects affected by our actions. And Bentham famously asks, the question is not whether they can reason, but whether they can suffer in terms of non-human animals. In my book, however, I criticize Singer and utilitarianism. I think that there are insights to be gained from that tradition, but the reason that I love my child and care for my child is not simply because he can suffer. It's because I recognize that he is worthy of loving, and I structure my identity and my sense of self and my way of being in the world around that care. So my book takes a kind of pluralistic view to ethics. I draw on a variety of different traditions, but I really think that this is key. If we're not able to see other beings as worthy of our love and respect, then we can and will do whatever we like to them. Whereas from the utilitarian point of view, it's all about the suffering, right? And so even committing acts of great violence against animals by killing them, Peter Singer gives a pass to that. He's okay with killing animals if you can do it, quote, humanely and painlessly after a nice life. Now that to me is very problematic because you can't really care for another being if you're okay with committing an act of extreme violence against them, can you? I mean, if you're in, let's say you're in child welfare services or something, and you don't want children to suffer abuse or whatever, but you're okay with killing them. Does anyone see what's the matter with this picture? So I don't. I think that utilitarianism, as I say, it has some insights, but ultimately it's an insufficient basis for ethics, and certainly for animal ethics.
Interesting. Okay, so it's not about rationality, it's not about suffering. Then what is it about?
We are destroying the means of life on this planet. I mean, I don't. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, but it's not at all. I mean, the we all know or should know about global warming and the calamity that that's causing the Earth. We're rendering large sectors of the Earth uninhabitable for human life, but also for our neighbors, non-human life. Animals are dying in droughts and fires and floods and storms. Their metabolisms and nurseries and so forth are being radically disrupted by capitalist development and by the effects of that global warming. And global warming itself is an artifact partly of the animal agriculture system, since the number two leading cause of carbon emissions is animal agriculture. So you're saying, well, what is it about? It's an existential question, Jason, of how we want to be on this earth. Are we going to continue to be the demon of this planet, subordinating, harming, killing, causing immense suffering, unending suffering to billions, literally billions and trillions of animals every year, when none of it is necessary, as I've said? And in the process of that, as I've said, undermining the conditions of all life. Or is there a better path? Is there another path? And I'm suggesting that there is. And one of the chapters I have is about Martin Buber's philosophy of I and thou. Martin Buber was one of the great Jewish theologians of the 20th century. And, he makes a distinction between going through the world, treating everything around one as a thing or as a kind of encountering it as in its objecthood, and approaching living beings from a different perspective of a different mode of address, which is to say, a mode of receptivity to the other as having an integrity of its own. And that is the model that I'm saying that we urgently need to move towards. And frankly, having studied animal ethics and animal behavior or cognitive ethology, animal minds for decades, uh, I am personally, it's just so obvious that the other beings of the earth are actually worth listening to. They're actually worth connecting with, relating to, entering into respectful relations with, loving. They're not inferior, degraded beings whose lives are garbage. But we do treat their lives as garbage. And I know some people will be offended by my saying that, but because everyone wants to think they love animals. Well, if you're going to kill billions and billions of these creatures every year and think that it's not even a moral issue, which, by the way, is the way society views this issue, there's something wrong there in the way you're viewing them. Because most people who in this country who have lived with cats and dogs would never agree to seeing their cat or dog stomped on or stabbed or shot in the head or whatever, because they understand that those beings' lives are beautiful, that they have that our cats and dogs have feelings and curiosity and attachments and preferences and a biography. Well, and that's lovely that people can see that in many cases with their cats and dogs, but it's a kind of moral blindness that keeps people from understanding that there isn't anything special about cats and dogs vis-a-vis other animals, that other species also have complex subjectivity. So it's so moral life, and I teach, ethics is partly about uh, moral consistency, right? I mean, Aristotle in his virtue ethics and the Nicomachean Ethics, that's the whole basis of virtue is trying to be good and maintaining that a consistent effort to be good over time. And that's a tradition worth learning from as well, virtue ethics.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you for that. So I want to make a distinction between like the individual being context and the global context, right? So it sounded like that those two were kind of blended together. And it makes, I mean, like in reality, they are, right? Like I acknowledge that there are these global problems that come from our view of animals. But I kind of want to focus on like the individual context. So my question is, what is it about a thing that makes it have intrinsic value? It sounds like you think animals have intrinsic value, but it's not rationality and it's not the ability to suffer. So it must be some other property, right? Because I don't think you think rocks have intrinsic value.
Hmm. Yeah. Thanks for that. What I argue in the book is that consciousness has an irreducible value. Well, why? Okay. Um, Consciousness, first of all, is a singular. Every consciousness is a singularity. What do I mean by that? I mean that every consciousness is slightly different. You can say that about rocks, but in a very different way, because a consciousness is a being in the world. It's a subjective point of view. It's having a world, and in phenomenological terms, there's that Zen koan. If a tree falls in a forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? No, it doesn't. But if there's an insect in the forest, if there's a deer in the forest, they hear it. And in the hearing of it, they constitute a world that wasn't there before. So what I'm saying, is I'm drawing here specifically on the existential phenomenology of thinkers like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the post-war French philosopher, to describe the richness, the variegated richness of consciousness in our embodiment. So as I say, or I argue in my book, consciousness, ought to be defended, and consciousness is not the same thing as ChatGPT, and it isn't the same thing as bacteria in one's gut, etc. That philosophers, as you know, philosophers of mind still argue about what consciousness is and how it's possible, and so forth. But to me, that is the ground floor of ethical considerability. I mean, we don't know very much about how an octopus, for example, is a mollusk, like an octopus, is able to do the things that the octopus does. It's extraordinary, right? And their nervous systems evolved in a completely different evolutionary line from our own. Maybe I think it was I want to say 800 million years ago. It was 500 million years ago. It was a long time ago that, cephalopods, mollusks, and so forth branched off from the line that would lead eventually after the collapse of the extinction of the dinosaurs to mammals. Just because we don't understand it exactly doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. So I understand that arguing about an intrinsic value ultimately I don't think that through philosophy we can arrive at certain truths through reason alone. I think there's a place for empathy, feeling, intuition, and at some point, if humans matter, and we could argue that humans don't matter, like, a psychopath would say, well, it doesn't matter if I kill my neighbor. What do you say to the psychopath? Well, you can get all philosophical and try to argue the psychopath out of that belief, but good luck with that. at a certain level, if I'm arguing with someone that other animals matter, if they're closing themselves off empathetically to a kind of knowledge, then there's nothing I can do about that. There are certainly I can argue for why other animals have freedom. They're capable of freedom, of autonomy, of reason, of a kind of reason, what Steve Wise calls practical autonomy. I can give those arguments, but ultimately, you either give a damn or you don't give a damn. And the giving of a damn, uh, I'm saying, is ultimately going to be tied to two things. One is what I've been describing as empathy, an ability to feel one's way into others' experiences and to get knowledge from that. And secondly, to have a kind of value structure that believes in equality, that believes in justice, and that affirms a world of comity, comity. In other words, getting alongness, harmony. So there are a lot of things that go into what I'm calling animal ethics here. But again, coming back around to your question, what gives other animals and their intrinsic value? It's their consciousness. I believe that's the demarcation line there.
Okay, now that was useful. So that position parallels Gary Francione's position, right? Like he thinks animals matter because they're sentient. And I don't really know what the distinction between sentience and consciousness is. I just kind of use them interchangeably, but it sounds like it's his position.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to Gary's abolitionism for sure. My book is an abolitionist position. I'm sympathetic to Tom Reagan's position earlier than Francione's in his book, The Case for Animal Rights, where he defends a conception of the subject of a life, animals as a quote subject of a life. And in my book, I say using a language like that is fine to talk about the intrinsic value of other beings' lives and consciousness. But I'm not that hung up on the terminology, just as you were saying, sentient versus consciousness versus conscious. Um, Sentient means typically it means a kind of feeling, like being able to feel. But I'm fine with that. Sentient, conscious, a person, a someone, somebody's home. That's a term that Sue Donaldson and Will Kimlicka use in their book Zoopolis. They argue that when there's someone home, they should be treated with respect and be granted inviolable rights. Well, what's an inviolable right? It means a right that can't be violated. So even insects, right? We think of insects as just disposable. I mean, people, like I was at a friend's house recently, and I noticed they had this big can of, black can of Raid, a nerve gas to spray on animals who enter their homes. And I get that. I used to be the same way, but it's a kind of insanity because we're not seeing even quote even insects as they are. We see them through a kind of mediated haze or mediating haze of cultural myths and stereotypes and so forth. So we think of insects as dirty, scary, not as conscious, really. They're just kind of moving around, almost like animate objects. And scientists, what they're learning about invertebrates, including insects, spiders, it's amazing. Like like some ants exhibit forms of more forms of learning, or as many forms of learning as humans. Um, they navigate. I used to think ants only navigated by scent. They put down their feelers and by chemical traces. No, they look at the angle of the sun. They count their steps. There's just a lot going on there that we may never fully understand, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a subjective experience of the world. And again, I do think, Jason, that there's a kind of leap of faith involved. Either it's a spiritual matter whether we want to embrace others, whether human others or non-human others, with a kind of generosity of spirit, a curiosity, a humility, a respect, or not. That's a choice that we make. And in this country, what we're seeing is a form of power, political power, that's committed to the opposite of that. It's committed to cruelty, hatred, discrimination, inegalitarianism, injustice, violence, conceptions of natural supremacy. I'm talking about the Trump movement, MAGA, and the extreme right. It's the opposite of the kind of ethos and political project that I defend in my book. But that's a choice we make.
Okay. So I think it's a good time to transition to the second deception. If I remember correctly, the second deception is about how we can eat meat while treating animals justly, right? Like I have heard of, these small scale farms and, there's a way to kind of manage the animals so that we don't have to use factory farms. Okay. Like free range chickens or something like that. Right. Or maybe cows that can just kind of roam and graze and stuff like that. Right. I mean, like in comparison to factory farms, it does seem better. Right.
Yeah, sure. In the same way that if you gave me the choice, right, of being in, say, a Soviet gulag or some terror prison, if I had to choose between that and being able to roam around, the woods for a month before someone shot me, maybe I would choose the latter. But it doesn't. There's a problem here with language. It's really Orwellian when we talk about humane exploitation, humane or compassionate killing. These are contradictions in terms. I mean, there's no question that animals suffer terribly in industrialized agriculture, but there are so many problems with framing the problem that way. For one thing, why is it that we have factory farms? Is it just that because people are they want to torture the animals? No. It's because of capitalist development and the tendency under the iron law of capitalism, really, which is monopolization. I mean, if you look at the number of farms that there used to be in the United States, animal farms, you look at the number of companies that controlled animal products, there were many more, right? And now you just have, I can't remember exactly who the big five are now, but they include, JBS in Brazil and Purdue and Tyson and so forth, who produce traffic in the bodies of animals. It's like a monopoly system. So if you want to produce a commodity for profit, you need to lower your costs. That's just competition. So that's why we have animals concentrated in feedlots or, 50,000 chickens in one airless warehouse. Where their entire metabolisms and biology are controlled, scientifically controlled, in order to maximize egg production, um, without any consideration whatsoever to the needs of the animals who are being exploited. So there's no question industrialized animal agriculture is horrible. But what I've tried to point out in this conversation, and I point out at length in my book, there have been principled objections to animal agriculture as such for thousands of years. Well, why is that? Because people even in the ancient world, Plutarch, Porphyry, Pythagoras, the first person to call himself a philosopher or lover of wisdom, um, believed that killing other animals for food was barbaric and wrong. Leonardo da Vinci, during the Renaissance, believed that to be true. Leo Tolstoy, in the mid to late 19th century, before factory farming, condemned the exploitation and killing of animals in food for food production. So we have this view that smaller scale farms, organic farms, are kind, but they're not. I mean, on even a small farm, what happens, say, for milk production, is that the cow is typically forcibly impregnated, sexually violated, in order to be made pregnant. The cow lactates for her young, for the calves. The calves, when they're born, are taken from their side, ripped from their side, which causes trauma to the mother and the calf. And by the way, mothers and their young can recognize each other years later if given the opportunity. So they attach to their young the way we do with our babies, right? I mean, I remember when my son was born, the feeling I had meeting him for the first time, whether it was, yeah, whatever the evolutionary reasons why that capacity developed, and it's obvious, right? You need to have, for mammals, you need to have the either the mother or more than the mother, the father also caring about what's happening, and caring for that child. That was this miraculous moment. And we see this in other species too. A friend of mine just last week in New York was telling me, she was watching these rabbits in her yard, a mother and a baby rabbit, and this crow came down and grabbed the baby and began to and took off with the baby in its beak, and the mother leaped up into the air and knocked the baby rabbit out of the crow's grasp, and um, and immediately picked up the baby and ran off. So I'm just giving one example of what happens to the treatment of cows. Okay, then the calf is typically either killed or sent into the veal industry to suffer there. And those, even on smaller scale farms, all of those animals in almost every case go to the same slaughterhouses that are used to kill animals raised in quote factory farms. But I could go on all day about these connections. Meanwhile, beginning about 20 years ago, as I said, there's this discourse of the humane farm that has been carefully cultivated, and the way that corporate America has used that is it just kind of gives the lie to the system, because there've been investigations of the Chipotle restaurant chain, for example. They claim to source animals from humane farms, and there've been undercover investigations of how they've been switching suppliers to meat from factory farms. There've been investigations of so-called gentle farms, kind farms, where the animals are suffering, left to die, of wounds and so forth. But again, just to strip it down, just the last thing I'll say about this is, if you get down to brass tacks, what you're doing is you're saying this class of beings is of is of so little value, so little intrinsic worth, that exploiting this class of beings, and killing its members has no moral implications, or has no is not a moral harm. And if that's your starting premise, then of course you're going to have suffering, and of course you're going to have basically atrocities committed against animals. And we see this over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, I mean, your position on this second deception naturally follows your position on the first deception, right? Which is that animals have intrinsic value. If you think that animals have intrinsic value, then you wouldn't be in support of these, quote unquote, humane farms, because they're still treated as means, right? Even if the cow can, roam around and graze grass, the cow is still going to be slaughtered for meat.
Again, I think it's a useful thought experiment to think about why it would be wrong, say, to have free range children and allow our human children to run around, and then, yeah, we do some instrumental things to them. We might sexually mutilate them a little bit. We might limit their autonomy, keep them in a one little grassy area. Maybe we don't truly give them a range of possibilities to satisfy their inclinations to curiosity and so forth. But then we kill them at 3 years old. Is there anything wrong with that? It's a thought experiment, right? Well, if I think intuitively we understand that is grotesque. That's monstrous to treat children that way. And philosophers can bend themselves into pretzel shapes trying to explain why that is. What is wrong with killing little children? And just to be clear on this show, I am not advocating murdering children. The philosophers could say, well, because they even if they don't have reason yet, like if you could say, well, reason is what makes humans uniquely valuable. Even if children are not rational yet, they will be, right? They'll grow up to be rational agents, and therefore, killing a child, you're preventing this reasoning autonomous being from developing in future. Or if you're a utilitarian, you can say that killing a rational being who's still in development is thwarting their future possibilities, et cetera, et cetera. But you can always find exceptions to the rule. What about a child who has terminal cancer? Does that mean that we can test pharmaceuticals on them, or that we can harvest them for their meat? What I'm saying is that the deontological position, right, which is the position that we should treat other beings with a kind of absolute respect, by recognizing, or from recognizing, their intrinsic value, that we can arrive at the deontological position through, as we started out, saying, through empirical sciences, by understanding the ontology, the actual being of these other beings, and through a kind of spiritual and emotional openness towards them. And I think that that's a richer, so my argument in the book is really that's a richer, more meaningful way to live a human life. It's a better way. It's a more fulfilling way, even for us. So it's not about self-sacrifice. I want to be very clear about this. Like not consuming animals, not contributing to the system. It sounds like, oh, you're that I'm uh, advocating asceticism, right? That the vegans have to live like a joyless life. It's quite the contrary. I mean, not only is there a limitless number of delicious things you can eat as a vegan, but more to the point, it's a more complex, a more interesting, and valuable way of living on the earth. Having a nonviolent approach to other beings, human and non-human.
Okay. So is your position that animals and humans are equally intrinsically valuable?
It's not a question I find terribly intelligible. Is a mosquito's life as valuable as a human life? Obviously, from the mosquito's point of view, yes, or more, or whatever. I mean, you can put yourself in the position of the other being and think that, well, what's the basis of comparison here? I mean, we can certainly find that there are properties uh, of humanness that are that we might decide are more interesting or offer more valuable forms of experience than we would find in a mosquito. But at the same time, there's so much we don't know about, and that we'll never know, to be honest, about what life is like for a mosquito. I think we need to be cautious about that. Certainly, even if we decided, and I don't feel comfortable saying it, that a cow's life is less valuable than a human's life, and I'm happy to explain why I don't feel comfortable with that. But even if we decided that, it wouldn't mean that we're entitled to do what we like to the cow, right? I may very well decide that Einstein's life was more valuable, had more meaning than many people I could name. But that doesn't mean that just because this person's life, life purpose, a character structure is less valuable. It doesn't license violence. And I think this is a really important point, right? That when people ask this question, well, are all lives equal? Behind that is an assumption of what I call human species right, which is to say, this idea that we have as a species the right to do whatever we like to the other beings whom we consider inferior, even if we decided they were less than us, which we need to reject, in my view. But even if we decided that, it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow logically. Therefore, we can do genetic testing on them. We can raise them and then kill them as while they're young and so forth. It's just we have to get outside that mentality. And I think, for people who have become animal rights advocates, who have kind of gone through the looking glass, as I think about it, and had a paradigm shift in the way we relate to other beings. Once you get it, it becomes very, very simple. You just there are just certain things that it's wrong to do, and we understand this intuitively, and we understand it, and we can show it empirically that suffering is not a good thing, and that freedom is a good thing, and that means freedom in for other beings as well.
Okay. So what's your position on lab-grown meat?
Well, I have a website that I cultivate about that called cleanmeathoax.com, cleanmeat-hoax.com. And I and other scholar activists in critical animal studies mount a dozen or so arguments against that technology. I think the main problem with it, in my view, is that it's a false solution to the problem. It misnames the problem. Bruce Friedrich of the Good Food Institute, he and I debated, Vasily Stenescu, a scholar in critical animal studies, and I debated Bruce Friedrich and Leah Garces of Mercy for Animals on this topic a few years ago. And Bruce Friedrich has said in interviews that the clean meat lobby wants to take ethics off the table. Those are his words, meaning that the discourse of lab grown meat typically, in many cases anyway, most cases, doesn't name or talk about this massive structure of violence that we've created Instead, it talks about the supposed health benefits, uh, the supposed ecological benefits of shifting to so-called lab-grown meat. Well, Joe Fessler, among others, has really questioned the plausibility of this, the scalability of this technology. I think there are very good reasons to think they're right about it. I mean, just the amount of steel that you would need to create these giant vats, the need for biosecurity. I mean, in the sense of, if you're going to grow lab-grown meat, these are living cells, right? Animal cells, and they're prone to pathogens, and I mean to bacteria. So you're having the same questions, problems of, sterile facilities to prevent public health problems. I mean, imagine that, you have this technology and people started getting sick or dying from E. coli or something. Now that happens all the time in the animal system and people don't even think about it, right? You would just have to have one person die from this new technology, and I think people would, who are already skeptical of it, right, would really run in the opposite direction. Look, it's simply not necessary. The lab grown meat lobby is saying, "Oh, meat is delicious. Everybody needs meat. Let's keep eating meat, but just eat this meat." Well, if you're going to support the larger brand and you're going to say that meat is an eternal commodity, then the game's over right there because um, in order to get people to shift to eating lab grown or yeah, synthetically produced animal flesh, the person or the public has to care enough, right, to do that. Well, why would they care enough about that? Well, they presumably would have to care about the animals. Well, that means that we would already have had to convince human beings that animals matter, and we haven't done that yet. And by talking about lab-grown meat as a commodity uh, that's necessary, it's already subverting that project. So, at any rate, it's it would take decades, if ever, to scale this up to the point where it would replace conventional animal farming. And there's no evidence whatsoever that that will happen. So again, I think it's a false solution to the problem.
Okay, so that criticism sounds like a not necessarily a moral criticism, but a practical one, right? You're saying like, look, it's just practically impossible or infeasible to have enough facilities to create that this lab grown meat to meet the demand that we have to consume that meat. So it's just not going to work on practical grounds. But I guess I'm more interested in just like the morally speaking, right? Because if we're talking about grown meat, then we're not talking about sentient beings anymore, right? Like on that ground, there was no moral objection, correct? Like there's nothing intrinsically wrong with eating lab grown meat.
I think that there are valid ethical criticisms that people have raised about this technology. For example, the use of bovine fetal blood to as a growth medium in the development of this technology. Taking animal cells from living beings in order to cultivate the product. Personally, I think those are the less interesting problem or the less significant problems. So while on the one hand I agree that like my personal position is not that it's inherently unethical, the technology or whatever. My position is that, I mean, because I don't just do philosophy, I do sociology and political theory in a sense as well. That you have to look at the forces, the social forces that have led to this technology. You have to look at the discourses around the technology and how they function within the capitalist economy. Who's pushing this? Biotech, entrepreneurs, venture capitalists who place their faith and animal advocates who place their faith in the commodity system and capitalism. But, as someone who studied the history of social movements, I can tell you that there has never been substantive social change in a positive direction because of innovations in technology or capitalist development per se. I mean, the reason that women have the right to vote is not because the steam engine was developed or something like that. Now, I am simplifying a bit here, but it's the problems that we have on this planet are not going to be solved. They're not technical problems. The idea that the reason that we dominate and kill other animals is because we don't have good things to eat otherwise is simply a lie, right? I mean, there have been ethical vegetarians for thousands of years, vegans in Japan, in among Buddhist monks for what, almost 1,000 years or something. So it's misleading the public to say that, well, right now there just isn't anything good to eat, alternatives to animal flesh, but with this technology that would be possible. So again, I think to me, and that is itself unethical, the way the discourse is evolving and has been used is unethical. But I'm talking about not just the implausibility, the technical feasibility aspect of this. To be clear, I'm talking about the way this movement, the biotech juggernaut for this technology, has weakened animal advocacy itself. It's weakened the animal rights movement, partly through the effective altruism movement, philanthropic movement known as effective altruism, which has this ridiculously simplistic understanding of society and economy that dooms the movement to irrelevancy in the long run. So anyway, if people are interested in this, I'd go to the website. I run cleanmeathoax.com.
Okay. I think it's a good time to transition to the third deception, which was self-deception, right? So what's the self-deception here?
So, every vegan gets thrown the same questions. Well, carrots are alive. Do you eat plants? Plants are alive. Native Americans, they prayed to the animal before they killed them. Do you also therefore think that sitting down to, I don't know, a plate of sprouts is mass murder? So, though I'm just giving a couple of examples of many others that I could give of bad arguments which fall apart under the least examination that people immediately leap to ward off a deeper self-reflection, a deeper moral analysis of what we do to animals. So that I describe in my book as bad faith. Again, that's a term that the philosopher Sartre developed in his book Being and Nothingness. But what does that mean? Okay, well, Sartre's position, which I largely agree with, is that we have a kind of freedom to determine the values that we have and the kind of persons that we want to be. But when we feel the weight of that responsibility, when we feel uh, begin to feel anxious that maybe we're not acting entirely autonomously, we're going along with the so-called herd, we're going along with what other people are doing, then we turn our backs on the truth and we lie to ourselves. Now, as Sartre points out, you can't, I mean, like if I said to you, Jason, go ahead and lie to yourself, how could you do that? So Sartre's position is that deep down, there's part of us that does know that we're lying. And I give the example of someone, say, who's cheating on his spouse or girlfriend, and says, "Well, I'm not going to tell her because I don't want to hurt her feelings. So I'm going to continue my affair because we're having a nice time." But, well, honestly, that's a form of immoral behavior, and it's obvious. But to the person who who's looking for an excuse, right? There's always an excuse at hand. And this is something that's basic to all existentialist thought, really, is that there are no excuses, whether you're talking about Kierkegaard or Dostoevsky or Sartre or Camus. It's the same idea that one of the things that does make us possibly unique as animals is that we have a capacity and a responsibility to choose the values that we live by. Now, when it comes to the meat economy, as I've said, people don't want to think of themselves as not respecting animals. They don't want to think of themselves as bad people. That's natural. Who wants to think of themselves as a bad person? And that's why when there's a vegan in the room, it makes everybody uncomfortable, right? Because there's a cognitive dissonance there. People do not want to be reminded. They look, food is so central to our identity and it's so intimate. Right? What could be more intimate than what we put in our bodies? So if someone says to us, "Hey, wait, do you know where that food came from? Do you know that that was a being who was in the world and curious and who then suffered and was treated unjustly, people just don't want to hear that. And if I ask my undergraduate students, for example, before they go to lunch, do you want to see this video, Meet Your Meat, about animal atrocities, about what happens in the food industry? How many do you think want to how many of them raise their hand and say they want to see that? They don't want to see that. And it's understandable they don't want to see that. But as a philosopher, to me that raises an interesting question because we think of our species as the species that wants to know, Homo sapiens, you know. We but the truth is that we don't want to know uncomfortable things. We don't want to know things especially that might make us feel bad about ourselves. Uh, but if we are to be moral beings, being a moral being requires a kind of truthfulness within the self and not a disappearance of the self within the mob. So, last thing I'll say is so in my chapter on this, I talk about Sartre's phenomenology of anti Semitism. And he talks about the way the anti Semite submerges his or her identity within the mob and takes their identity, builds their identity around hatred of Jews. That's what gives the anti Semite a sense of purpose, a sense of integrity, a sense of power. I am not a Jew. The Jew is the negation of Europe, etc. Well, we have organized all of human culture, in a sense, in a similar fashion around the negation of the animal other, and that leads to bad faith.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying. I think there is this element of people just understanding that there's something wrong, especially with factory farming, right? And then that leads to them not wanting to know more about factory farming, right? Because people generally don't want to think that they're bad people, you know?
Yes.
I put myself in that category as well. I feel like this problem, philosophically, I think one side clearly wins. Okay. I don't know if I would say I don't like I don't value an ant as much as I do a human being. I think that there is some value to consciousness, and perhaps there's some sort of gradation, and perhaps a being that has more sophisticated consciousness and perhaps even rationality. I think does have moral weight because I think that there's something there about the ability to suffer that resonates with me. And I think that a more sophisticated, cognitively sophisticated animal can suffer in other ways and more ways, perhaps, right? And I think that's what's doing the moral work. But I mean, even if you were to believe that, like that, I think almost everyone's going to admit that the animals that we typically eat do suffer and that, that they shouldn't suffer, you know. Um, but again, we like how they taste, right? Perhaps some of us do think that we need them for nutritional reasons, or maybe it's just more convenient to get our nutrition from them, right? And so we kind of try to rationalize our habit of eating meat, right? But I think if you just dive a little deeper into it, I think those arguments just kind of fall apart. Like I really don't think that there is a moral justification for factory farming specifically. I think the larger problem is, again, it's not philosophical. The larger problem is psychological. The problem is that people just aren't motivated enough to change their behavior. Right? You have a few exemplars, right? People who do, they read the arguments and they're convinced by the arguments and then change their lifestyle, right? But the vast majority of people aren't going to do that. Okay. So in a sense, I think the problem is no longer philosophical. I think the philosophy is already done. We can put that aside. The problem is motivational. And I think that this is true for other aspects of like ethics as well. If there is something that's been so normalized that it's so wide and so widespread that people really just do it and don't really question it and don't really want to question it, you know, philosophy is only going to get so far.
I agree. Again, I teach a class on introductory ethics, and and I say this in my book, by the way, in my introduction to the book, that there've been principled arguments against treating animals violently for thousands of years. So that's just not the. I mean, it's like saying, well, the reason there's global warming is we don't have good theoretical models of carbon gases. No, that isn't why we have global warming. It's because there are these enormously powerful economic players, institutions that control the state, that ensure that no change happens. And plus, people don't want to change their behaviors, right? That's kind of what you're saying. So there is, you called it a psychological aspect. And I totally agree. And I think what's interesting to me is, again, I mentioned Aristotle, is that when we think about what it means to be a good person or to be an ethical agent, you have to want to be good in a sense. And if your definition of the good is simply what everybody else is doing, which is how a lot of people see things, then ethics is sunk. I mean, this is something important that we get both from Aristotle and Immanuel Kant, the idea that a moral action depends on what Kant calls goodwill. A point that Aristotle makes relatedly is that even someone who sins, as it were, someone who's engaged in a behavior that they know is not right, but if they're trying to change, then you can't say, then at least they're trying, there's value in that. But if someone just doesn't care to change, or doesn't care whether they're a good person, well, there's no remedy for that, according to Aristotle. If you're just corrupt, then you're corrupt. And we live in a society that's corrupting, that gives us every possible disincentive to do the right thing. Like, if I go visit my family, I'm here in the Boston area on the South Shore, I can either take the train or I can drive. Well, driving, of course, pollutes. I'm going to be at risk of killing a variety of animals on the way, etc. But the problem is that the train is expensive. It doesn't run very often. I have to get a ride from the train station to where I'm going. You know what I'm saying? So that's just a kind of trivial example of some of the disincentives. So people resist change, even though, it's not that hard to become a vegan. It just isn't. And then when you've done that, you don't look back. It's just nothing. I mean, it's just it's just ridiculously easy if that matters to you, what you do to other animals. But because we can get away with it, right? People can go along with it, and it's easier to do. People do go along with it. But there are two problems with that. One, as I've said, is that this is not a way of life that is ecologically sustainable. You can't have 8 to 10 billion human beings being provided with the bodies of trillions of animals every year without destroying everything on this earth. And so that's kind of what you could say a practical objection. But secondly, if we take seriously the idea that justice matters, that being good matters as opposed to being evil, then this is an issue that we need to confront and not avoid. And I understand that it's very hard for people to get their minds around that. But what I argue on the first page of my book is that this is not merely this is not, as people think, a trivial issue. This is the most important issue of our time, how we treat the other beings of this earth and the animal food system, which is this massive system I've described of violence and violation. One last thing I want to say, though, is that I don't agree that factory farming is the problem. I mean, the reason that people talk about factory farming is because of animal rights activists who've made that an issue for decades. That's the only reason. It was those folks who introduced this to the public. And now people understand vaguely that, quote, factory farming is bad. They don't understand why we have it, and that's because, as I said, of capitalism and human supremacism. Uh, they they think that there are now two forms of animal agriculture. There's the bad kind, which is factory farming, and then there's the good benevolent kind, which is smaller scale. Not so. And if you're gonna start with the first one, I'm sorry, the second one, the smaller scale agriculture, you're gonna end up with the industrialized one because the smaller scale one is also a system of violence. It's also a system of exploitation. It's also a system that is organized around the principle of domination, natural domination. So actually, there have been strictures against excessive violence, not excessive violence, excessive cruelty to animals for thousands of years in the Old Testament. In the case of the animals versus man, an Islamic text from the 10th century, there's already in that discourse, many centuries before so-called factory farming, in that discourse, there is of the case of the animals versus man before the king of the jinn, which I could talk about, fascinating. There's already a critique of human exploitation and violence against animals. Again, more than 1,000 years before concentration of animals in American agriculture, the late 19th century. So all this is to say that there's something that's hiding in plain sight, which is human supremacism, if you want to call it that. And it's an urgent problem to be confronted and overcome.
All right. I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jason, and stay philosophical.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ethical Frontier. If you want to support my work, you can do so at patreon.com/chenphilosophy.